There's an Indiana regiment there too. 168 lost. Charge made on this railway cut, the 2nd Mississippi Regiment. Officers, men, and battle flags surrendered to the 6th Wisconsin. Took them out. There's the 95th New York left. They spread out quite a bit. Fairly large distance comparatively.
Beyond that and above it would be Park Service Center Robinson, large white building, partially covered by trees, about 1.5 to 2 miles away. Cemetary Ridge, marked by those 2 locations, would be the shank of the fishhook. From there, the bend in the hook began as the line turned to your right and began to rise around a rather large prominent hill, Cemetery Hill, located just south of the town. Today, covered by trees. That would be the rounded part of the fishhook, and then the final part of the fishhook is not visible from your location. It was a large wooded hill, as it is still wooded today, Culp's Hill. Again, that entire line was 3 to 3.5 miles long. Understanding the Meade wants to fight a defensive struggle, it's much more clear at this point why Little Round Top is so important. One of the most vulnerable parts of any battle line in the Civil War or any other war would be the flank or end of your line. If the enemy can put his forces beyond your flank or perpendicular to it, you can then assault your line from the side or from behind, from the rear. So you always try to want to anchor your flanks on strong terrain features such as a river or a hill. Little Round Top provided that very strong anchor for the left end of the Union battle line. He sent one of his 10 companies, Company B, about 30 men, into the woods off to his left. That way they could detect any Confederate movement trying to outflank or get around his line.
Smart.
Keep in mind also, as we describe this fighting here in this location, that the stone walls around you did not exist on July 2nd, 1863. Like the ones we saw on the top of the hill, these are also built later during the battle by other Union troops once Little Round Top was saved. Another thing you need to note is the fact that the trees around us come really the closest we can get to what all the woods would have looked like during the time of the Battle of Gettysburg. You'll notice the trees in our immediate vicinity are much thinner. There's hardly any underbrush or undergrowth, and thus you could see much further through the woods at the time of the battle. The same would be true for the woods directly to your front beyond the Park Road, where Big Round Top is located, as well as the woods off to your left or to your east, where Chamberlain sent Company B.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Now, of course, Chamberlain and his men had no idea what was heading towards them. We know today, of course, what it was 2 Alabama regiments, the 15th Alabama and the 47th Alabama, that actually numbered all told about 750 men. Fields to your left front, south of Devil's Den and into the gorge between Big Round Top and Devil's Den to your left rear. This Confederate force that eventually would attack both Devil's Den and Little Round Top consisted of 2 Confederate brigades of Texas, Arkansas, and Alabama troops numbering approximately 2,600 men. Immediately upon seeing the Confederate advance, Captain Smith sought help by requesting that the 4th Maine move into the valley behind you. Ordered by General Ward to do so, the 4th Maine reluctantly moved into their new position. We will pick up their story later in the tour at Stop 5. Meanwhile, Smith himself would begin to direct the fire of his guns upon the approaching Confederate line. Despite the fire, the Confederate advance continued down the long ridge, across the fields to your left and left front. This attack would sweep across the fields of the John Slider farm, which would be the white and fieldstone buildings to your left front, less than a half a mile away. Eventually, the Confederate attack reached the low ground below you, and thus momentarily fell out of view of the Union line. This was caused by the ledge you see located in front of you today, just beyond the Park Road. Unknown to Smith and the other Union soldiers along Houck's Ridge, the main Confederate force that would soon bring them under attack was the 1st Texas, which numbered approximately 425 men. Sensing that his guns alone could not stop the Confederate assault, Captain Smith then went to the 124th New York and requested that the regiment make a counterattack. This regiment, approximately 240 strong, was commanded by Colonel Augustus Van Horn Ellis. Ellis, sensing any counterattack would be too desperate, refused, however, ordered his men to their feet, and his line moved to the crest immediately to your right. Soon after, the 1st Texas appeared along the ledge marked today by the stone wall just beyond the Park Road. Immediately, the 124th New York and Smith's guns opened fire. Let's examine this struggle through the eyes of the attacking Texas soldiers at stop number 2. Take the dirt path. Retiring the guns might not only discourage the Union defenders, but embolden the Confederates advancing through this area. Though it might mean the sacrifice of his guns, Captain Smith decided to fight them to the bitter end, leaving his guns in place at the top of the ridge. While this struggle on the western side of Houck's Ridge and Devil's Den was occurring, keep in mind that other Confederates were approaching Devil's Den to your right or south, and also advancing through the gorge between Devil's Den and Big Round Top to your right front. Let's pick up that fighting at our next stop. The path you'll be walking on is the remnants of an old electric railroad line built in the 1890s, before most of this land was purchased and protected by the federal government. Proceed down the path to your right till you reach stop number 4, which is located at the intersection of the old railroad line and Plum Rock. You're facing north. Devil's Den is to your left, and the 99th Pennsylvania Monument, where we started our tour, is clearly visible on the crest of the ridge above Devil's Den. The advance of the Alabama regiments through this gorge between Devil's Den and Big Round Top to your right rear was exactly what Captain Smith had been fearing earlier, a Confederate force attacking him from the rear. As noted earlier at stop number 1, to counter this possible threat, the 4th Maine Infantry was moved down into the Valley of Death, where we are now located. The small regiment, 290 strong and commanded by Colonel Elijah Walker, would form its battle line across the valley directly to your front, the center of their battle line being marked today by the medium-sized obelisk monument on the large boulder on the other side of the parking lot. Unaware that the 4th Maine was located in this area, the Alabama soldiers were surprised by the first volley from the Union line, knocking many soldiers down and driving the rest under cover of the boulders around you. At the same time, this fighting now developed east of Devil's Den. Recall also that other Confederate troops were attacking from the other side. In the area, Union artillery, which had just reached the top of Little Round Top, opened fire, catching many Confederates in the open and driving the rest into the cover of the rocks before you. With mounting exhaustion and heavy casualties, the Confederates realized that any advance towards Little Round Top from this direction was now impossible. Still wanting to support the Confederate effort on Little Round Top, however, many soldiers here began to take cover behind the boulders, some even stacking up surrounding walls. By 3 p.m. of July 2nd, General Sickles and his 3rd Corps had completed its forward movement. Once established, his new battle line took the shape of a rough inverted V, and the Wheatfield itself would be in the middle of the left wing of that V-shaped line. The low ridge you're standing on starts at Devil's Den to your left front, which marked the far left end of Sickles' line, intersected through the Wheatfield itself, and ended approximately 500 yards to your right or west at the Peach Orchard Knoll. Defending this area would be approximately 1,400 Union soldiers made up of 5 regiments, all commanded by Colonel Regis de Trobriand, a French officer now serving with the Union forces. Supporting de Trobriand's brigade were the 6 Napoleon cannons of Battery D, located where you're now standing. The Confederate attack on July 2nd started at approximately 4 p.m. and would be launched in echelon style from your left to right. This attack, under the command of Lieutenant General James Longstreet, consisted of 8 brigades totaling 14,000 men. The initial attack would strike the far left end of the Union line at Devil's Den and Little Round Top at 4:30, and then as more Confederate brigades were fed into the battle would grow in size and move in this direction, from your left to right. The first Confederate attack to struck the Wheatfield came at approximately 5 p.m. De Trobriand's line had been shifted by that point to the southern edge of the field, located at the stone wall to your front. Let's examine that attack from the location of the 17th Maine Infantry. This stone wall marked the southern border of the field in 1863, and it should be noted is the original wall that predated the battle itself. It was built by the same man who owned the field, George Rose. The woodlot to your front, also owned by Rose, is original. Keep in mind, however, that the woods were much less dense than you see today, being free of undergrowth, thus allowing the soldiers behind this wall to see nearly all the way through the woodlot itself. By the time de Trobriand's men reached this wall, in time to meet the first Confederate assault in this location, the fighting at Devil's Den to your left front had been raging for about a half an hour. De Trobriand himself had been ordered to shift 2 of his regiments away from this area, and thus he was only left with approximately 720 men. Left. Unknown to the members of the 2nd New Hampshire and the other Union defenders of the Peach Orchard at this time was the fact that their fate was now going to be sealed by another Confederate attack coming from a completely unexpected direction. Around 6 p.m., a new Confederate attack would advance directly from the west, or to your right. This attack would be launched by 2 Confederate brigades. Artillery prepared the way. Another New Hampshire soldier later recalled this. Then came the storm, he said. Every rebel gun was let loose until the Peach Orchard seemed to be almost moving in the windage of hurtling metal. Under the cover of this tremendous fire, the final decisive assault was made by Barksdale. Formed by battalions in mass, in line of battle, his troops swept steadily forward. This attack by Barksdale's brigade would be long remembered by men on both sides, and was described perfectly by another Confederate soldier who witnessed it. He said, as Longstreet's brigades came into action, the roar of cannon was accompanied by the rattle of musketry, mingled with the yells of our boys as they moved forward broke the Union battle line at the Peach Orchard, sending it retreating not only north or away from you in the direction you're facing, thus up the Emmitsburg Road. Corps line retreated to your right front, or to your northeast, in the direction of the Trosel farm. Thus, a huge hole now existed in the middle of Sickles' line, where the point of the V used to exist. This movement also put Barksdale's brigade in great advantage over the right wing of Sickles' position. In order to cover a dangerous gap in the Union battle line, this gap existed once again because of General Sickles' decision to move forward and take up his new line of battle. As discussed earlier at stop number 1, one of the mistakes that Sickles made was overextending himself, thus literally leaving gaps or holes in his line. The ground you just crossed between stops number 4 and 5 were a 400-yard gap in that line, now covered by nothing but artillery. To backtrack slightly in the story, this artillery arrived to the left of the barn. General Sickles, unfortunately, never made it. Looking to the left of the barn, you'll notice a small monument topped by a diamond shape. This monument marks the spot where Sickles was badly wounded. A 12-pound cannonball struck him just below the right knee, shattering his lower leg. Upon being taken out of the saddle, his staff took him behind the barn, where he was quickly treated, a tourniquet applied to his leg, and he was then taken to the rear, never to plant troops in the field of battle again. The lower part of Sickles' leg was later amputated that evening, and Sickles continued his recuperation in Washington, D.C. At this point, turn around and face the field you just crossed. The same field the 9th Massachusetts Battery retreated across, as we described at the end of stop number 5. After what must have seemed an eternity, they reached the location where you're now standing, at which point the battery got a slight reprieve from the fire coming from the 21st Mississippi to your right and right front. This reprieve was given to them by the rise of ground that you just walked across. This knoll to your front hid the advancing Confederates from view. Bigelow said it was then his intention to limber up and get out before they closed in on us.
So this is the tail end of Clipsville.
This is East Cemetery.
This is East Cemetery. Two humps. Big hump.
Looking at it, you'll see atop of it the equestrian monument to General Robert E. Lee, the commander of the Army of Northern Virginia here at Gettysburg. The memorial was dedicated in 1917 as the first state memorial to Confederate troops who fought this great battle. By 1 o'clock on the afternoon of July 3rd, the weather turned quite warm and quite sultry. Things were strangely quiet also on the battlefield. The fighting at Culp's Hill had ended earlier that morning at about 10:30. Skirmishing in the fields in front of you had also ended earlier that morning, and by this time of day it was just too warm to fight. Many of the soldiers lay in the sun or in the shade, trying to find some shelter from the blazing sun that burned down on them. The only thing you could probably hear maybe was the occasional bird in the trees or the rustle of soldiers' feet going through the tall grass. The afternoon quiet was shattered at 1 o'clock by the sound of a single gun fired from the direction of the peach orchard. It was followed quickly by the sound of another gun. These were the signal guns that opened the cannonade fields against placed here in the morning, as was the artillery. The Confederate cannonade began at 1 o'clock with the firing of two signal guns from the direction of the peach orchard, both fired by the Washington Artillery of New Orleans. Immediately after the second gun was fired, all the Confederate artillery pieces along this line fired towards the Union line. Over there was General Henry Hunt, the commander of the U.S. Artillery of the Army of the Potomac. Hunt had been very careful to place Union batteries all up into Kemper's men were both deployed in this area and lying down during the cannonade. General Kemper described the cannonade and the effects on his men, remembering, "I made my men lie flat down on the ground, a precaution which poorly protected them, for the enemy's hail of shot pelted them and plowed through them, and sometimes the fragments of a dozen mangled bodies were thrown in and about by a single missile." While this was going on, Longstreet rode slowly and alone immediately in front of our entire line. He sat his large charger with a magnificent grace and composure I have never before held. This bearing was to me the grandest moral spectacle of the war. I expected to see him fall at any instant. Still he moved on, slowly and majestically, with an inspiring confidence, composure, self-possession, and repressed power in every movement.
I've been recorded before. a long walk into musket fire. Let the rebel yell at this final point.
No.
That's the trail for, I assume, Trimble and Pettigrew.